Thanks, Chairman. It's my honor to be here attending the online workshop. I will talk something about China's national interests and the Korean nuclear crisis. My presentation will contain 4 parts. First part is about the DPRK's nuclear crisis, and the second part is how to cope with the nuclear crisis. The third part is about China's national interests and its diplomatic policy toward the Korean Peninsula. The last part is the conclusions. From 1992 to now, the Dpr's nuclear crisis have been lasted for almost 30 years. The first nuclear crisis was eased up in 1994 by signing the framework agreement. The second nuclear crisis broke in 2022 and lasted to now. And in the past 30 years, DPRK conducted 6 nuclear tests in this period and became a nuclear power in fact. What's the reason and purpose of DPRK, and how to cope with DPRK's nuclear crisis? What's the impacts and the consequences for the related country, and how the nuclear crisis affected the Sino-DPRK relationship? My presentation will talk something about this. The first one, the DPRK's nuclear crisis. The reasons for developing nuclear weapons. Why Koreans want to develop nuclear weapons? I think there are 2 reasons. The first one is objective factor. The DPRK want to protect its national security to deal with the United States' long-pursued hostile policy. And the second one is the subjective factor. Korean DPRK want to strengthen its political and social control of the Korea in order to maintain the stability of the regime. About the purpose of the DPRK, there are a lot of people doubted about that. What's the real purpose of DPRK? I think to possess the nuclear weapon is a strategic decision of DPRK, and to abandon its nuclear program or denuclearization is just a tactics. So, how to cope with the DPRK's nuclear crisis? There are some options for international communities. The first one is a peaceful solution based on negotiations. And the second one is a solution based on the use of force. The third one interferes in the international affairs of North Korea, creating dramatic changes in the political situation. The last one is a secret American-North Korea deal. During the past decades, these concerned countries try to establish a peace and security mechanism in this area continuously. The 6-party talks is the most newly achievements, and it's almost a historical choice. Though there is no result now, the 6-party talks, and a lot of people think the 6-party talks is a total failure, but I don't think so, because the 6-party talks achieved a lot of movement. It's the right direction. Because the direction of the 6-party talks is still correct. That based on the negotiation to solve this problem. The third part, I want to talk something about China's national interests and its diplomatic policy toward the Korean Peninsula. I think there are 2 characteristics of China's policy toward the Korean Peninsula. The first one is the continuity of China's policy toward the Korean Peninsula, and the second characteristic is the flexibility of the policy. I want to talk the first characteristic, a continuity of China's policy toward the Korean Peninsula. Chinese national security interests determine its diplomatic policy toward the DPRK, basically, because the Korean Peninsula is located at the Northeast Asian hub, where the mainland and the sea powers meet with each other. Since Korean Peninsula is adjacent to China's capital area, when Ming Dynasty moved its capital to Beijing for the special geopolitical reasons, the Korean Peninsula bear particular importance for China's security during past few centuries. It determines that China's policy toward the Korean Peninsula has an obvious characteristic, i.e., consistency. That's why the Ming Dynasty used its army to help the Koreans against Japan in 1592. The Qing government sent troops to Korea Peninsula fighting against Japan in 1894. Jian Cai and the CCP supported the Republic of Korea's independent movement. It's also why the newly founded China involved in the Korean War in 1950s. Due to the geopolitical reasons, these choices were inevitable. Now, China's current interests on the Korean Peninsula. There are two interests on the Korean Peninsula. The first one is to maintain the peace and stability of Korean Peninsula, and the second one is to assure it is denuclearized. To keep the peninsula's stability is determined by China's ground diplomatic strategy. Because China wanted creating a peaceful and benign international political environment to facilitate domestic economic reforms. And the first concern of the Korean Peninsula is to avoid war and to maintain stability and peace. Because any military strike could lead to a comprehensive Korean War, leading to regional instability, which will no doubtly affect China's economic construction seriously. The outbreak of war will bring some awesome consequences. Since China has very deep economic ties with South Korea, Japan, and the United States, the outbreak of war would destroy the prospects of China's economic development. And the second one is the outbreak of war is likely to lead to the collapse of the North Korean regime and will not only bring tremendous economic and security consequences to China. At the same time, it will lead to the rapid reunification of the Korean Peninsula, and the future of the Korean Peninsula will become uncertain. The third one is because the war would arouse a serious refugee problem in this area. To keep the peninsula nuclear free is the second concern of China, because DPR's possession of nuclear weapons will harm the long-term interests of China and increase the instability and the possibility of war in this region. And it could lead to a regional arms competition and a nuclear proliferation. So the most concern of China is to keep the stability and peaceful in this area. The second characteristics of China's diplomatic policy toward the DPRK is the flexibility. China's relations with DPRK have been consistent and highly prioritized, but as the international context has changed, so too have China's interests. China's strategic bottom line, the denuclearization of is that the denuclearization of the peninsula. If DPRK touches the bottom line, China will no doubt say no loudly. The boundaries of Sino-DPRK relations. Nowadays, China's diplomatic strategy shifts from traditional bilateralism to more multilateral. Originally, The Sino-Dpr relations is something called blood bond alliance. But now we focus on the relations between our two countries as the traditional friendship. It's merely friendly relations like other countries. So we can see China and the DPRK is drifting apart, but need each other. The last part is the basic conclusions. The first one, DPRK's extreme risk-taking policy cannot be tolerated or accommodated. And the second one is China will pay close attention to who, South Korea or DPRK, will reunify the Korean Peninsula, and in what way to achieve the unification. The third one is the Sino-DPRK relations should be subordinated to the Sino-American relations. The last one is put China's responsibilities and obligations to DPRK and that to international community. Only pay close attention to this for conclusions. We can we can protect our national interests. That's my presentation. Thank you.